A British Lieutenant General walks into a factory. He's carrying a white flag and a Union Jack. He sits down across a table from a Japanese general who, by all military logic, should not have been winning. One man commanded over 80,000 soldiers. The other had barely 30,000 and was running out of ammunition. The Japanese general looked the Brit in the eye and made one demand: surrender. Now, unconditionally. Or tonight, I level the city. It took less than 30 minutes. No final defensive stand, no last charge, no last-ditch battle at the gates, just a signature on a piece of paper, and the largest capitulation of British-led forces in the entire history of the British Empire was done. When Churchill heard the news in London, he later wrote that it was being the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The Japanese general who engineered that surrender was bluffing. His own army was on the verge of running out of supplies. His troops were exhausted after 70 days of relentless fighting across 1,100 kilometers of jungle. He later admitted, in his own words, "My attack on Singapore was a bluff that worked." So how did 80,000 soldiers, better supplied, better fortified, fighting on home territory, give up to a force a third their size? The answer involves a catastrophic miscalculation years in the making, a military campaign so audacious it rewrote the textbook on jungle warfare, and a moment of psychological pressure that broke British command at exactly the worst possible time. Stay with this, because what actually happened is far more complicated and far more damning than what you were probably taught. To understand how Singapore fell, you have to understand what Britain believed it was. By 1941, the island of Singapore was called the Gibraltar of the East, and not just in newspaper headlines. It was official British military policy. The War Office, the Admiralty, the Foreign Office, all of them treated Singapore as the linchpin of British power in Asia, an impregnable base, a fortress island that could withstand any attack. And on paper, the case for that confidence wasn't entirely absurd. Singapore sat at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, flanked by water on three sides. It had a massive naval base, the largest dry dock in the world east of the Suez Canal. It had coastal artillery batteries capable of sinking battleships. The port was one of the busiest and most strategically vital in the entire British Empire. There was just one problem with the entire fortress narrative. It wasn't built to stop a land attack. The coastal guns, heavy 15-inch artillery pieces designed to engage enemy battleships, were oriented outward toward the sea. British military planners had spent decades building the defense of Singapore around one assumption, that any enemy would have to come by sea, because the Malay Peninsula to the north was considered impassable. The jungle was too dense, the terrain too hostile. No modern army, the thinking went, could move an invasion force 100 kilometers down that peninsula fast enough to matter. That assumption was wrong in ways that would prove catastrophic. And here is something even more striking. When Churchill was told, just weeks before the surrender, that the northern side of the island had virtually no prepared defensive fortifications, he was genuinely shocked. In his memoirs of the Hinge of Fate, he wrote that the possibility of Singapore having no landward defenses had no more entered into my mind than that of a battleship being launched without a bottom. He had believed the fortress was real. He had never asked. Neither had his advisors told him. The fortress was a story Britain had told itself for so long that its own leaders had started to believe it. That belief was about to collide with reality at roughly 40 kilometers per hour, on bicycles. December 8th, 1941. One day after Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces landed on the northeast coast of Malaya, at Kota Baru, and simultaneously in southern Thailand. The invasion of the Malay Peninsula had begun, and from the very first hours, everything the British had assumed about the terrain was being proven wrong. The Japanese 25th Army, commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had prepared for this campaign with meticulous precision. They had studied the road networks of Malaya. They had trained their men for jungle warfare, and they had equipped their troops with something that caught British commanders completely off guard: bicycles. thousands of them. Japanese infantry rode through the Malay Peninsula at speeds that mechanized British units, dependent on roads and fuel convoys, could barely match. When they encountered roadblocks or blown bridges, they dismounted, carried the bikes through the jungle, and reassembled on the other side, outflanking Allied positions before the defenders could consolidate. This tactic, later called the bicycle blitzkrieg by historians, was not improvised. It was a deliberate solution to the specific terrain challenge of the Malay Peninsula. The result was a pace of advance that stunned British commanders on the ground. In 70 days, Yamashita's force covered 1,100 kilometers. That's an average of roughly 15 kilometers per day through tropical jungle against a defending force that was supposed to stop them. But the disasters kept stacking up. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the landings, the Royal Navy suffered one of its worst defeats of the entire war. HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, two of Britain's most powerful capital ships, were sunk by Japanese aircraft off the coast of Malaya. In a single afternoon, Britain lost its naval supremacy in the Pacific. The sea lanes that were supposed to be defended were now completely exposed. General Percival, commanding British forces in Malaya, was left fighting a land campaign without air cover, without naval support, and against an enemy who was moving faster than his intelligence reports could track. The Battle of Slim River on January 7, 1942, illustrated exactly how badly the situation had deteriorated. Japanese tanks broke through the defensive lines of the 11th Indian Division in the early hours of the morning, and the breakthrough was so rapid that entire Allied units were cut off before they could react. The road south lay open. By January 11th, Kuala Lumpur had fallen. By January 31st, the last Allied troops retreated from the mainland into Singapore, and engineers blew up the causeway, the bridge connecting the island to the peninsula, behind them. It had taken Yamashita's army 54 days to conquer the entire Malay Peninsula. Now they were at the water's edge, and Singapore was on the other side. When the last British, Australian and Indian troops crossed into Singapore on January 31st, 1942, there was a brief, desperate window of hope. The causeway was blown. The sea channel between the island and the mainland was a barrier, however narrow. For a few days, it seemed as if the defenders might be able to hold the island itself while reinforcements arrived. The problem was that the reinforcements that did arrive, including the 18th British Division, which sailed into Singapore Harbour in the final weeks of January, came too late to be properly integrated, too late to be briefed on the terrain, and into a situation that was already tactically compromised. And the island's defences on the northern shore, the side facing the mainland, the only side the enemy could now attack from, there were almost none. The bulk of the coastal guns faced south and east, toward the sea. The northern coast of the island, the Johor Strait side, less than a kilometre wide at some points, had minimal prepared defensive positions. No concrete bunkers, no extensive field fortifications, no depth of defence. British commanders did what they could in the days they had. They deployed troops along the northern shoreline, strung barbed wire, laid minefields. But against a force as experienced and aggressive as Yamashita's, these preparations were thin. On the night of February 8, 1942, Japanese forces crossed the Johor Strait in assault boats. Despite withering fire in some sectors, they established beachheads on the northwestern coast of the island. In the following days, the fighting was intense, particularly involving Australian units at the causeway sector, who inflicted significant casualties. But the Japanese pressed inland, and coordination among the defenders became increasingly difficult. The Alexandra Hospital massacre on February 14th, in which Japanese soldiers killed patients, medical staff and prisoners inside a military hospital, underscored the brutal reality of what was happening on the ground. That event was documented and investigated after the war. Water was now the critical resource. Japanese forces had captured key reservoirs on the island. Singapore's civilian population, estimated at close to 1 million people, including a massive influx of refugees from the mainland, was dependent on the same water supply as the military garrison. By February 15th, the city had at most a few days of water remaining. The military situation was deteriorating by the hour. Ammunition was critically low. The northern perimeter was buckling. Fires burned across the city. The civilian population was packed into the southern part of the island with no escape. General Percival faced an impossible calculus, and across the Johor Strait, General Yamashita was facing one of his own. Here's what Yamashita knew on February 15, 1942, that the British did not. His army was nearly spent. The 25th Army had advanced 1,100 kilometers in 70 days. Supply lines from the north were stretched to the breaking point. Ammunition reserves for heavy artillery were critically low. Some accounts put Japanese artillery shells at roughly 100 rounds or less. His troops were exhausted from weeks of continuous combat. He had roughly 30,000 men on the island against a defending force more than twice that size. If the British had chosen to fight a prolonged urban defense, drawing Yamashita's forces into house-to-house combat across Singapore City, stretching out the siege for another week or two, the Japanese supply situation would have become catastrophic. Yamashita acknowledged this directly in post-war accounts, so Yamashita did what a skilled commander does when his cards aren't strong. He played the game differently. He demanded a meeting. He projected absolute confidence. He moved his artillery positions frequently, creating the impression of a larger, better supplied force. He conducted feint attacks across multiple sectors to keep defenders off balance and prevent them from concentrating forces. When Percival arrived at the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah at 5:15 in the afternoon, Yamashita delivered the psychological blow he had been building toward for days. Through his interpreter, he communicated a single demand: unconditional surrender, immediately. No conditions, no negotiation. He projected absolute certainty, the posture of a general with every card in his hand, when the reality was the opposite. Percival asked for conditions. He wanted to retain an armed British force to maintain order in the city, to protect the civilian population from the chaos that would follow a full surrender. Yamashita's response cut that off. He demanded an immediate answer. He threatened a massive attack on the city that night if unconditional surrender was not accepted at once. Every minute that Percival hesitated, the pressure mounted. At approximately 6:10 p.m., Percival signed the surrender document. Unconditional, no retained forces, no negotiated terms. It was over. When the white flag went up over Singapore on February 15, 1942, approximately 80,000 to 85,000 British, Australian and Indian soldiers became prisoners of war. The majority were moved to the Changi area on the eastern end of the island, a complex of British military barracks the Japanese designated as a prison camp. In the initial weeks, Allied officers maintained internal organization. Libraries, informal schools, theater productions, attempts to preserve morale where both were under constant assault. But Changi was not the final destination for most. Beginning in mid-1942, large groups were transported, often on overcrowded, disease-ridden ships, to locations across Japanese-occupied territory. The most notorious destination was the Burma-Thailand Railway, the Death Railway, a 415-kilometer line built through brutal terrain on starvation rations, without medical care, under conditions that killed through cholera, dysentery, malaria, and beriberi. The physical brutality of guards was documented extensively by survivors. By the end of the war, approximately 12,000 Allied POWs had died on that railway, alongside an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Asian laborers also forced into the project. For the Indian soldiers captured in Singapore, the situation carried an additional dimension. Many were pressured to join the Indian National Army, a force fighting alongside Japan against Britain. Those who refused faced the same deprivations as their British and Australian counterparts, often worse. The men who did survive came home changed in ways their families and societies were not always prepared to understand. When the news reached London, Churchill was at Chequers. By his own account, he went to bed without telling his staff. He didn't sleep. The worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. In purely factual terms, it was accurate. But history has since had to ask a harder question. How much of what happened was Churchill's fault? The documented answer is, substantially. Churchill had spent years prioritizing Europe and North Africa. Every modern aircraft, every trained division sent east came at the cost of something not being sent. The decision to divert Hurricanes and Spitfires away from Malaya toward the Soviet Union and North Africa left the RAF in Singapore, flying obsolete aircraft against a force with air superiority. There is also the matter of the warships. HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were sent to Singapore in late 1941 as deterrents, a show of force. They went without an aircraft carrier because none was available. When they moved to intercept Japanese landings on December 10th, Japanese land-based bombers sank both ships in under 2 hours. In his cables to Percival and General Wavell in the final days before the surrender, Churchill demanded that the island be defended to the last. He wrote that senior officers should die with their troops rather than surrender. Percival, who knew the ground reality Churchill could not see from London, made a different calculation. A prolonged defense would produce mass civilian casualties without changing the military outcome. Whether that was the right call remains debated. What is not debated is that by the time Percival walked into the Ford Motor Factory, the decisions that made surrender likely had been made years before, in budget meetings, strategic planning sessions, and the cables of a war cabinet fighting a global war with finite resources. The man who signed the surrender was the last in a long chain of decisions. He just happened to be the one holding the pen. The British Empire had rules. One of them was unspoken but universally understood. It does not lose. Not like this. Not to this. The first consequence of Singapore's fall was psychological, and it hit the empire everywhere at once. For populations across India, Malaya, Burma, and Hong Kong, watching 80,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers surrender to an Asian army wasn't just a military headline. It was proof, irrefutable, undeniable proof, that the empire could be beaten. Churchill understood what that image meant. His demand for a fight-to-the-death defense was partly about exactly this. He knew the optics of defeat would send a message to every colonial territory in Asia. He was right. It did. The second consequence landed in Tokyo. The scale of Japan's victory emboldened military leadership in ways that contributed directly to strategic overreach. The belief that Western armies could be broken quickly fed into planning decisions that eventually led Japan into conflicts it could not win. The third consequence was for the 80,000 men themselves. Their captivity, and the medical, psychological, and social damage they carried home, became one of the most significant veteran welfare crises of the post-war period in Britain and Australia. And the fourth was for Singapore itself. The Japanese occupation lasted 3.5 years. During that time, the Chinese civilian population was subjected to systematic violence. The Sukching massacres, in which tens of thousands of Chinese Singaporeans were killed. That occupation created the collective trauma and political consciousness that shaped Singapore's path to independence. The city-state that exists today, one of the most prosperous nations on earth, was built, in part, on the wreckage of February 1942. There is a photograph that was taken in the Ford Motor Factory on February 15, 1942. In it, General Yamashita sits at the head of the table, broad-shouldered, imposing, flanked by his staff. Across the table, Lieutenant General Percival sits slightly turned, one hand resting on his leg, his face carrying the weight of what he is about to do. The Union Jack he brought with him stands nearby. The image was widely distributed by Japanese propaganda as evidence of Imperial Japan's military triumph and the collapse of Western dominance in Asia. It was one of the most powerful propaganda photographs of the Pacific War. What the photograph doesn't show is what was happening inside Yamashita's head at that moment. The knowledge that his supply lines were critically strained, that his ammunition was nearly gone, that if Percival had looked him in the eye and said, "No," the entire campaign might have unraveled. It also doesn't show what happened to Yamashita after the war. He was tried by a U.S. military tribunal in the Philippines in 1945, convicted of war crimes related to atrocities committed by forces under his command, including the Manila Massacre during the final weeks of the war. He was executed by hanging in February 1946, almost exactly 4 years after the surrender at the Ford factory. And it doesn't show what happened to Percival. He survived Changi. He survived the war. In September 1945, he was present on the deck of USS Missouri when Japan formally surrendered, standing near General Douglas MacArthur, who signed on behalf of the Allied powers. The man who had signed the surrender at Singapore was there to witness Japan's own. History, in its way, completed the circle. 8 decades of military analysis have produced several lessons that emerge with particular clarity from the documentary record. Assumption-based strategy kills. British planners built Singapore's entire defense around assumptions. Jungle impassable. Attack must come by sea. Air superiority guaranteed. Every single assumption was wrong. And because those assumptions were baked into doctrine over decades, they were nearly impossible to correct even as counter-evidence mounted. Prestige creates strategic blindness. Singapore's reputation as an impregnable fortress made honest assessment politically dangerous. Acknowledging the gap between myth and reality would have required difficult decisions years earlier. Instead, the fortress myth was maintained at the cost of actual fortress preparation. Resource allocation in a global war demands hard choices, and those choices have consequences. Churchill's decision to prioritize Europe and North Africa over Asia reflected genuine strategic logic, but Singapore paid the price. Chronically undersupplied, the garrison never had the modern aircraft or armor it would have needed to hold. Intelligence determines everything at the moment of decision. Yamashita's bluff worked entirely because Percival had no accurate picture of the Japanese supply situation. Had he known Yamashita was nearly out of artillery shells, the Ford factory meeting would have gone very differently. The inability to know what the enemy actually has, as opposed to what he appears to have, is a permanent feature of warfare. Singapore is one of its most consequential examples. And beneath all the operational analysis, one fact remains. The 80,000 men who walked into captivity on February 15, 1942, were not variables in a strategic equation. They were soldiers from Britain, Australia, India, and the Commonwealth, placed in a position made unwinnable by decisions made far above their heads. Thousands of them never came home. Those who did carried Singapore with them for the rest of their lives. Was Arthur Percival a coward? An incompetent? The historical record says no to both. Percival inherited a defensive situation compromised by years of underfunding, flawed doctrine, and strategic misalignment. He fought the campaign on the peninsula without adequate air cover or armor, with troops not trained for jungle warfare. He made errors. The deployment along the northern shore was criticized even at the time, but he was operating under constraints that had been imposed long before he arrived. When he walked into the Ford Motor Factory, he wasn't surrendering out of fear. He was making a judgment, based on water supplies, ammunition stocks, and 1 million civilians with no escape route, that continued resistance would produce mass civilian casualties without altering the outcome. Yamashita's own legacy is more complex. The Malayan campaign remains one of the most audacious military advances of World War II, but the atrocities committed under his command, in Singapore and later in the Philippines, are inseparable from that record. He was executed for war crimes in February 1946. Churchill's verdict on Singapore was the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. The fuller historical verdict has to include Churchill's own role in creating the conditions that made it possible. Singapore did not fall because of a single decision. It fell because of a cascade, budgets, strategy, assumptions, overconfidence that converged at a table in a factory in Bukit Timah on a February afternoon in 1942. They never have one cause, the great military collapses. They have 100 causes, stacked until the weight becomes impossible to carry. 80,000 soldiers put down their weapons, not because they had no courage, but because the situation they were in had been made unwinnable long before they ever picked them up. The Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah still stands. It has been converted into a museum, the Memories at Old Ford Factory, preserving documents, photographs, and artifacts from the Japanese occupation of Singapore. The table at which the surrender was signed is gone, but the room remains. In Changi, a chapel built by POW hands during the occupation, the Changi Chapel, has been reconstructed and stands as a memorial to the men who were held there. The death railway still crosses the Three Pagodas Pass. The bridge on the River Kwai, not the Hollywood version, but the actual steel and concrete structure built by forced labor, stands at Kanchanaburi, Thailand. At the nearby cemetery maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, over 6,000 Allied POWs are buried in identical white headstones in rows that extend further than seems possible. Each one of those headstones represents a man who was there on February 15, 1942, or who arrived at Singapore afterward. That man who went into captivity and did not come out. That is the physical weight of what happened when 80,000 soldiers surrendered without a single organized final battle. Not because they were defeated in the field, but because a general who was bluffing, who was nearly out of ammunition, whose own army was on the brink, pressed hard enough and fast enough at exactly the right moment. And the man across the table blinked first. The events described in this video are based on documented historical sources, including the Imperial War Museum, IWM Archives, the National Library Board of Singapore Historical Records, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission records, and academic works, including the official Australian War Memorial histories of the Malayan Campaign and the Singapore Garrison. General Yamashita's post-war admissions regarding the bluff at Singapore are documented in multiple primary and secondary historical sources from the post-war period. If you want to understand how one man's execution, ordered by the same Allied command that accepted Singapore's surrender, changed the rules of military law for every war that came after, that story is already waiting for you on this channel. The commanders who walk away from catastrophe and those who don't, that's the war nobody talks about enough. We'll see you there.